A wise man once said that knowledge is power, and Rory needed as much power as he could possibly muster if he was to have an iota of success in his campaign in Gaul. For so long, the Irish had been isolated to their island, battling amongst themselves, and this first foray against foreign foes had been an eye-opener. The strength of his men alone may very well not be enough. He would need to pick his battles and ensure he had the advantage, and the spy Donica McCarthy would be vital in enacting this strategy. To the south, Donica spied upon the Gallic capital, finding the elderly warlord surrounded by feeble warband. As soon as the reports came in, Kieran and Rory mobilised. The prospect of capturing an established capital city on the mainland, and to remove an experienced warlord in one foul swoop, was too tantalising to turn down.
Merging armies! Ambush in place. Yes.
With their force bolstered with mercenaries, Kieran and Rory began their trek south, taking destiny into their own hands. From the east came reports of German movement. While not currently concerning, it was something that needed to be kept in mind and monitored. Winter came around once more with the updated diplomatic relationships between the surrounding factions. The Romans were at war with the Gaul, further cementing Rory's plan of conquest. It is said that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, although the Gaul were not yet the enemy. Donica was pulled back towards the Gaul capital, ready for the impending invasion. A few more troops had appeared over the season, but nothing that Rory and Kieran wouldn't be able to handle. To the south in Italy, Patrick finds a Greek diplomat and barters an exchange of trade rights and map information, before carrying on his exploration of Europe.
Yes, master. Out of moves.
Summer comes, and the Germani had made their move. An alliance with Scythia would certainly prevent some eastern expansion for the Germanics, leaving only two other directions for them to expand to, with one being less desirable than the other.
Orders. Kill them!
With no time to waste, Rory advanced on Alessia, surrounding her walls and ordering the construction of battering rams.
Besieging settlement. Settlement under siege.
With the Irish back at war, it was time to clean up the channel that separated the settlements of the fledgling empire. The Gaul had been lingering for a bit too long.
Ready to sail.
It didn't take long for the Gaul to retaliate, laying siege to the skeleton crew in Samara Breva, and using a throwaway force to try and divide Rory's force. Good. Now the Gaul didn't have any walls to hide behind. Rory held the advantage in numbers and troop variety. He hoped that both of these factors would enable him to keep enough of his men alive to keep the momentum of his campaign.
The feeble enemy have more men. Ha! These are more heads for our warriors to collect in triumph.
The sound of thundering footsteps from behind had Rory turning his men around to face the oncoming force. He knew the city's army would be coming from somewhere behind him, but not exactly which corner of the battlefield they would approach from. At any rate, better for the Gaul to tire themselves out coming to the Irish than vice versa. A small contingent of his force along with himself would be able to deal with the lone warband. Kieran also joined the efforts in removing the warband, while the rest of the army made their way to face off the Gaul warlord and his retinue. With Rory leading the warband away, Kieran was presented with the perfect opportunity to charge his bodyguard right into the backs of the pursuing men. The impact of the cavalry wasn't the greatest, but it was a start. On the other side of the field, Brennus charged straight into the line of Irish warband. While the warlord had isolated himself from his force, he was still a formidable opponent, and so the break in the impacted units was not too unexpected. The warband captain finally goes down, and with that pesky distraction dealt with, Rory and Kieran could turn their attention back to the main fight. The Irish line had been split, but the fight wasn't over yet. Rory and Kieran turned their mounts around and rushed for the other side of the battlefield, ready to inspire and bolster their troops. The two groups of Irishmen held their lines valiantly, though that did not stop some turning hard and fleeing, the presence of their general not quite enough to bolster bravery within them. With charges of heavy cavalry to their flanks and a fleeing captain running through their ranks, the Gauls started to break and run. The number of Irishmen alive on the field steadily dropped, and more joined those already fleeing from the battle, but the same could also be said for the Gaul. The commander and a few warband was all that remained on the field for the Gaul. Rory ordered what remained of his men to surround the Gaul general and end his life. The cavalry were difficult to take down, but it didn't stop the Irish men from trying their hardest, though the unit of warband that took the brunt of the force from the cavalry wavered in their conviction. Eventually Brennus called out in surrender, but Rory wasn't feeling so generous this day. A lot of good men now lay dead on these rolling hills, and he was going to make sure that Brennus and his men joined Don in Tecduin. With every Gaul now either lying dead or ran off of the battlefield, Rory and Kieran could take a moment to breathe. Victory was theirs, but at what cost? While they may have won Alesia through combat on the field, they had lost more men to the Gaul than the two forces they had faced combined. Were the Gaul really that strong? Or was it poor tactics? Were their men simply not good enough to face off against the rest of the Celtic empires? The winter of 261 brings troubling news. The Gauls had aligned themselves with the Germanic tribes to the east, and the Germanic tribes with the Thracians. This was quite troubling news indeed. Rory had Donica increase his scouting in the east, lest the Germans act upon their alliance. The small force of Samaro-Breva challenged their invaders to gain an idea of what they faced. Despite having the advantage of walls, the 3.5 units of warband would be too much for the mercenaries and Irish warband. It would be best to wait for reinforcements. Rory sent a contingent of skirmishers and mercenary cavalry north to help push back the invaders, hoping that the range and movement advantage would be enough to turn the battle in Irish favour. The Irish were now in a perilous position. The Gauls surrounded them on the west, and they were pinned by Germania to the east and south. It would only be a matter of time before they followed their allies in repelling the Irish incursion, and all Rory could do was pray that neither faction called upon further allies. The thawing winter brought upon further change. The Gaul wished to take back what had once been theirs, sending Vindex to besiege Alesia, and Rory had his first sighting of Germanic troops within his border. So when the Julii came offering an alliance, Rory felt that he had no choice but to accept. He knew that the Roman family were also wanting the land that he was claiming, but for now, what can he say? The enemy of his enemy would be his friend. Patrick would continue with his diplomatic duties to the east, gaining trade rights and map information with Dacia. Patrick could only hope with recent events that his skills were enough to prevent more factions siding with the Gaul. The reinforcements from Alesia would not be able to make it to Samaro-Breva this season, and time was running out. The Gaul had put together a battering ram. Fortunately, reinforcements of swordsmen and warband from Londinium would be able to make it. The two forces were even, though the Irish had the numerical disadvantage, and the reinforcements from Alesia would remain too far away to be involved in this skirmish. The only advantage Captain Cian had over the Gaul were his swordsmen. The battered forces of Samaro-Breva would surely be a gamble on whether their morale would hold. Regardless, Cian needed to make a move to repel the Gaul. Cian needed to be smart for this battle. Throwing his men straight at the Gaul warband would be suicide, so it was fortunate that the field was lined with trees. He had his warband hide at the edge of the tree line, with the swordsmen ready to take the brunt of the Gaul warband. The forces from Samaro-Breva had arrived, and Cian was on the wrong side of the trees. While the reinforcements advanced, Cian and the warband moved to reposition before the Gaul could reach them. Lady Luck was with them again. The Gaul had stopped to jeer and shout at the Irish men, giving Cian time to get into position, and the men from Samaro-Breva to join their brothers. The Gaul advanced again, and Cian and his swordsmen shouted back with mighty war cries. Kian had the second unit of warband hide amongst the trees across from the first, while the depleted barbarian mercenaries were sent ahead to try and lure some of the Gaul warband into an attack. The Gaul didn't take the bait, and both factions merely exchanged loud cries for now. The warband on the southern flank continued to move through the forest to gain a better flanking angle. For now, the Gaul ignored their movement. Movement! The Gaul were repositioning, and this was Kian's chance. With the Gaul warband out of formation, Kian charged his swordsmen forward, and the hidden Irish warband emerged from the trees joining the charge. It wasn't the best charge from the warband, but the Gaul were surrounded, pinned between warband and swordsmen. Kian's swordsmen were quickly dropping, but not without taking out enough of the Gaul warband that they were confident in their victory. The fighting was bloody and brutal, both sides taking heavy casualties. The Irish were able to further wrap around the Gaul. Kian could see the fear and desperation in his enemy's eyes. They were starting to falter. Completely surrounded and suffering heavy losses, the first of the Gaul warband broke and ran. Seeing their fellows break rank and flee did little to help the morale of the Gaul army, and it didn't take much for the majority of the Gaul warband to be fleeing through the field like the rats they were. Invigorated by this change in battle, Kian rallied his men and charged toward the captain of the Gaul. Though shaken, the coward had remained to the rear of his army and still had a good number of men remaining in his unit. No matter, Kian and his men charged in all the same, cutting down any stragglers that got in the way. The Gaul fought hard, but the Irish fought even harder. Some of the Gaul warband had regained some of their courage and returned to the battlefield, but to no avail. The morale of the Gaul captain soon broke, and with it the rest of his army. With the death of the Gaul captain, the call of surrender was given. Kian did not hesitate in rejecting the call. Why would you let any of the Gaul leave this field if it gave them the opportunity to return? Kian and his men were exhausted, but they did their damnedest to ensure that most of the Gaul did not leave that field alive. Kian's effort weren't enough to disband the Gaul army, with 200 Gauls slinking back to their territory, but his efforts had been noticed by the High Chief, and he was presented with an offer of adoption into the family. Kian accepted the offer, gaining a contingent of heavy cavalry. At 20 years old, Kian had a promising career ahead of him. To the south, Rory gathered his forces together to sally out against the Gaul army under Vindex. Rory had the advantage with both number of troops and experience in commanding them, though Vindex wasn't without his merits. The man did know how to boost the morale of his men, but there was little else the older man could do compared to Rory. Rory had the home advantage, and the Gaul wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. It would be better to deal with a good portion of the Gaul army on his own terms, rather than be surprised later. Alesia was proving to be a rather bountiful town. Having been established upon a hill, it provided Rory with quite the advantage. With the exception of the 5 remaining barbarian cavalry, Rory had his army march out of the gates of Alesia to face the Gaul army. Warband made up the front line, with slingers and skirmishers positioned just behind. The swordsmen and general cavalry stayed on the wings ready to swoop in. The ranged units had just got into position when the Gaul charged forward. The Irish let loose their projectiles on the rapidly approaching Gaul. The Gaul infantry charged into the line of Irish, leaving a large gap in the middle. The Irish would maintain position for now, just in case any more Gaul charged in. On the far side of the field, Vindex sent a unit of barbarian mercenaries sprinting after Rory. Rory pulled back and ordered his swordsmen to engage. With his pursuers now occupied, Rory turned his cavalry towards the exposed flank of the Gaul warband. The Gaul were faltering, but the addition of barbarian cavalry charging into the line would not be good for Irish morale. Both sides of the Irish battle line were holding steady, and Kieran joined the charge into the wavering Gaul. The crash of heavy cavalry into the Gaul line was enough to break them and trigger the beginnings of a mass rout, and Vindex gave the order of a tactical retreat. Rory ordered his army to chase the cowards down. If they didn't severely reduce this Gaul army now, Vindex would only return the next season. Just under 400 Gaul were left when the call of surrender was given, of which Rory would accept on this occasion. Vindex would retreat into Germanic territory with barely an army to his name, and Rory would gain a veteran warrior in his retinue. With that, the summer drew to an end and the Gaul diplomats came begging for a ceasefire. Rory barely gave it a glance before rejecting the offer. He had the Gaul on the back foot, why would he back down now? At 30, Rory may not be a young ruler, but he still had much to learn, such as perhaps accepting a temporary ceasefire in order to bide his time, as the Irish now found themselves in a significantly worse situation. The Germanic tribes had attacked, the Irish were now surrounded on the mainland, and the Gaul had negotiated a ceasefire with the Julii. A constant stream of reinforcements from Londinium would be the lifeline for the Irish, seeing as the recruitment process will most likely be disrupted by constant besiegement. Basic mercenaries were available for hire, but the case could be made that they would act more as a liability for the morale of the Irish. Cian wouldn't be able to reach the Germanic army besieging Samaro Breva, his reinforcing troops too tired to make the march. The troops within Samaro Breva engaged with the Germanic army, pulling Cian in as reinforcements. The Irish had the slight advantage, they had the numbers and troop variety, as well as having a general on their side. The Irish infantry steadily approached the Germanic spear warband, cavalry on the wings, ready to flank. Cian was feeling confident. Admittedly, he had no experience in fighting spearmen, but after his recent victory, and with the clear advantage, this battle was surely going to end in victory. Skirmishers peppered the spearmen with their javelins, steadily reducing their numbers. Spying an opportunity, Cian ordered the charge of his cavalry while the spearmen were out of formation. Cian's heavy cavalry hit the back of the spearmen. The charge was successful, and the Germans' morale began to waver, but that would be quick to change. The spearmen were able to get back into formation just as the barbarian cavalry impacted the German line. The light cavalry was shredded under the Germanic spears, and by the time Cian shouted to pull back, it was too late. The barbarian cavalry broke and ran back into the town. While the Germans repositioned, Cian ordered the charge of the infantry. The warband engaged the centre of the spear warband and the swordsman wrapped around the side. Cian hesitated for a moment too long when ordering his cavalry into position to charge into the rear of the spearmen. By the time he was charging in, his swordsmen had broken and were retreating, their numbers severely diminished. The cavalry charge had worked, killing 30 of the spearmen in one foul swoop, but Cian had to quickly pull back lest he be stuck between two units of spearmen. The warband appeared to be holding steady against the spearmen, but not steady enough. They had taken heavy casualties, and with a second unit of spearmen approaching from the side, Cian couldn't blame them for running. With the men he was able to rally, Cian tried to take down the war hands that were on their tail. The dogs were vicious and quickly chewing through the warband, swordsmen and skirmishers. The fight seemed impossible and the dogs unstoppable. The infantry would retreat inside Samaro Breva, but would take the dogs with them, sealing their fates. There was little else Cian could do now. Samaro Breva was all but lost. His infantry were being torn apart from within the safety of the town walls, and fighting spearmen with only cavalry was suicide. The best he could do is pick off some of the dog handlers. A handful of men remained within Samaro Breva, the dogs an endless swarm. The remaining town force goes down, and all too soon all that remains on the battlefield was Cian. His spirit broke before any thought of entering the town came to mind. The Germans would not have been able to enter, but Cian alone would not have been enough to sustain a long term of defence. Better to let them take it for now and return another day with more men and a better strategy. Losing Samaro Breva was an unfortunate step back for the Irish conquest of Europe, and it was clear that the Irish were not yet capable of properly taking on the Germanic tribes. Throwing men against men wasn't going to work. At the very least, Kian didn't suffer any negative repercussions from his defeat. From Alesia, Rory sent a small contingent of men to assist with the recapture of Samaro Breva. It would hopefully be enough to retake and hold the town, so long as the Gaul or Germans didn't interfere. The next year brought some good news. The Gaul and Julii were once again at war. The force from Alesia made their way north. The presence of an enemy general was concerning, no doubt bringing more spear warband to cause issues. For now, Kian moved to join up with his brand new army, and would bide his time for the opportune moment to strike and retake Samaro Breva. Back in Alesia, Kieran gathered an army together in order to try and clean up the borders of the new Irish territory. His first target was the small Germanic force that had been hanging around for some time now. 2 spear warband and axemen, all not at their full strength. Kieran would have no issues subduing this force. The Germans had placed themselves at the furthest and highest point they possibly could, and so Kieran began the steady walk to join them. Kieran and his men hadn't been marching for long before the Germans began to run. Perhaps they were going to meet the Irish in the centre of the field. No, they were running from the field. Cowards.
Victory is victory, no matter how close. The dead lie all around, but you have prevailed.
The victory was neither close nor were their dead strewn around, but the Germans retreated to their own territory, and Kieran gained a galloper in his retinue. Not bad for a walk through a field. Come winter, the Briton have once again declared war on the Gaul. It appeared that the Germanic general wasn't interested in reinforcing Samaro Breva, so Kian took this as his chance to start the siege to retake the town that he had lost. To the south, Kieran followed the retreating German army into their lands. He wasn't able to get far, but he was at least able to block one road to Alesia. Back in Ireland, Admiral Finn docked at Tara and welcomed a couple of units of reinforcements and an assassin, ready for transportation to the mainland continent once the colder months had passed. Luck was not on Kian's side. It appeared that the German general, Hildius, was in fact interested in reinforcing Samaro Breva, hiring the local mercenaries and attacking Kian. Their forces were equally matched, and Kian might have a chance at victory if he was able to dispatch each force separately. Kian decided to deal with Hildius' army first. The morale of the mercenaries should be easier to break than those of the main troops. Surely they would value their lives over the money on offer. The two forces collided, warband crashed into warband. So far, the battle appeared to be going well. At the very least, it was going better than Kian's last battle against the Germans. Hildius would chase after Kian, so Kian led the German cavalry around and into the range of his skirmishers, allowing for them to throw a couple of volleys of javelins. The German general, being so close, seemed to have spooked the skirmishers, as moments later, without losing a single man, the morale had broken. Kian continued to leap behind the German line and charged into the rear of the barbarian mercenaries, bolstering the morale of the Irish on that flank. On the other side of the field, the spearmen had joined the fray. The swordsmen were the first to break, with their fellow warband quick to follow. Kian was stuck between Hildius and mercenaries. He was losing more men than he was killing. He was able to slip free, and Kian was realising that he was once again leading a doomed battle. The spearmen had turned their attention onto the remaining Irish men. Constant harassment from Hildius and the contact from the spear warband was enough to break the morale of the Irish warband. Kian tried charging into the backs of the spearmen in a last-ditch attempt, but the losses and the futility of this fight got to him too, and Kian joined the retreat from the field. Some men had rallied at the edge of the battlefield and were continuing the fight against the mercenaries. Most of the German army took to chasing the retreating Irish, leaving the skirmisher warband and a wavering swordsman to take on the unit of screeching women. The skirmishers had used the last of their javelin on the passing mercenaries. All they had left to take on the women charging at them were their daggers. Between the two, it was an even fight. Both sides were tired from the long skirmish. The swordsmen came charging in. They too were exhausted, and the morale well and truly shaken. With their general and majority of the army fleeing from the field, it wasn't surprised when the warband broke, with the swordsmen joining suit less than a second later. With that, the Irish suffered another defeat at the hands of the Germans. At least they were able to kill 400 of the bastards before being overwhelmed. Ciarán was forced to retreat to the south towards the now isolated city of Alesia. From the diplomats came news that the Gaul continue to form alliances with factions to the east and are once again in a ceasefire with the Britii. Ciarán would continue his pursuit of the small Germanic army from the southern border of central Gaul. The Germans retreated towards Lugdunum. Ciarán chose to abandon his pursuit of the Germans in favour of going after Balinus of the Gaul. He also didn't want to try his luck against a garrison of Germanic troops. Balinus retreated to the north with Ciarán just behind.
We shall rule.
In a show of overconfidence, Admiral Finn attacked the Gaul fleet blocking the port of Tara despite being able to slip away and deliver his passengers in Britain. Instead, he was defeated and forced to the north. Come winter, the Gaul and Britii are once again at war with each other to the surprise of no one. Ciarán resumed chasing Balinus through Germanic territory, pushing him back until he had him cornered with a river to Balinus's back. The forces of Balinus were at partial strength and were greatly outnumbered. Unlike Ciarán was certain he was going to provide the faction a great victory. The two armies would face off against each other on the field. Strong Irish warband made the front line with skirmishers and slingers protected just behind, and on the flanks the cavalry waited. The warband warmed up with war cries as the ranged units edged forward to start peppering the Gaul. Balinus was the first to charge in, trying to attack the slingers that had just slipped back behind the line of warband. The nearby warband surrounded Balinus and Ciarán charged into support. Encircled, it would not be long until Balinus began to run from the battlefield.
The enemy warlord flees from our warriors. Attack and drive them back in the same
In the
way.
absence of their general, the rest of the Gaul infantry charged in. A charge to the rear from Ciarán swiftly broke the morale of the Gaul warband. Balinus made an attempt at coming back, but with the rest of his army at flight and completely surrounded by the Irish, he too would join his fleeing men
Enemy
once
flees from
more.
the field like frightened goats. Hunt them down and slay them all.
Balinus was able to escape with his life this time, unfortunately. Ciarán and his light cavalry weren't quite fast enough to catch up. At any rate, they could make sure that the infantry don't leave alive.
We need fight no more. The enemy are in full flight, and the victory is yours.
Balinus slinked back to the south, and Ciarán would make his way north. Back near Ireland, Admiral Finn would attempt to deliver his passengers, but he would be attacked again by the Gaul and forced to retreat again. His attempt to complete his job would once again be denied by the Gaul, with Admiral Finn once again being attacked. He would win the first bout with the Gaul, but a second navy would completely overpower Finn, sinking the fleet and its occupants. Despite the troubles on the seas and mainland, the British Isles were developing very nicely, and the troops in Alesia were slowly being retrained, improved and increased. Ciarán had set his eyes on Samaro Breva and continued his march north, placing the town under siege in the summer of 256 BC. The Germanic tribes were hovering around the borders of central Gaul, but had yet to do anything, or be large enough to be of any concern. Yet. That winter, Ciarán would begin the fight to retake Samaro Breva. The gates were wide open, practically inviting Ciarán in to do what Ciarán failed to do.